There are some questions in politics that politicians, commentators, and public figures can dodge for years. Then there are the questions that stop them in their tracks. The kind of questions that instantly expose whether someone truly believes what they're saying or whether they're simply trying to protect a political narrative. Before we dive into the full story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, if you've been following this channel, you'll know we've covered Charlie Kirk quite a bit recently. And there's a reason for that. Over the last several appearances and public exchanges, especially during his visits to the UK, he's found himself facing audiences that aren't simply willing to accept talking points at face value. Instead, he's been confronted with direct questions, challenging follow-ups, and moments where the usual rehearsed answers suddenly don't seem quite enough. And in this particular exchange, that's exactly what happens. What starts off as a discussion about faith, values, and politics slowly builds toward one question that changes the entire tone of the conversation. It's a question that sounds simple on the surface, but the implications behind it are enormous. Would Jesus vote for Donald Trump? The moment that question enters the discussion, you can almost feel the atmosphere shift. Suddenly, this isn't just about party politics. It's not about campaign slogans, polling numbers, or policy talking points anymore. It's about whether the values many political figures claim to represent actually line up with the leaders they support. And that's where things start to get very interesting. As you'll see, Charlie Kirk finds himself navigating a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Because no matter which direction he goes, he's forced to confront a difficult reality. Defending a political figure is one thing, but arguing that figure embodies Christian principles is an entirely different challenge. So let's watch the exchange in full, because there's a lot to unpack here. And once we've gone through everything that was said, I'll give you my thoughts on what stood out the most and why this particular moment has generated so much attention.
You've spoken a little bit about your belief in the sanctity of life and the inviolable dignity of the human person. I take it that you accept evolution.
It depends what you mean by that.
Do you think we've evolved from primates?
I don't know.
Okay.
But I do believe in the biblical account of creation. I also acknowledge that there is an abundance of scientific research that shows adaptation. Species change is heavily inferred in the data. I don't know enough about it, but I believe the scriptures to be true. And you can be a theist and also believe in God-ushered evolution.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And so, of which I allow people much smarter than me to make determinations on that. It's completely irrelevant to my core theology, though.
Okay. Are you happy for me to proceed with the question,
Please,
though, on that basis?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah.
No, that's fine. So you're kind of not vaguely, but you seem generally happy with the idea that maybe evolution is true. I hope that that's the case. I mean,
well, I don't believe that. I think that
okay.
I'm not saying you said happy that evolution is true.
Well, not necessarily happy, but
well, that was the word
surely,
you used, though, right?
Okay, fine. Willing to accept that based on the evidence, evolution is a fact.
No, I'm not saying it's a fact. I'm actually, again, I say I'm open to have my mind moved, and I look at the data, but I believe, given the abundance of equal data that atheists must reckon with, that there is a fine-tuning problem to our existence that I believe warrants that there is a God, intelligent life came from a God, and I believe the scriptures to be true. That in the creation account, there is an allowance to say that God created the heavens and the earth and allowed us to either evolve through species. I happen to believe, through a faith claim, that human beings are designed. What that means is designed over a long period of time or designed immediately. That's for people smarter than me to determine.
Fine. I suppose what I'm getting at is if you believe in the sanctity of life and that there is something fundamentally different between the life of, say, for instance, a human being and the life of an animal, does that not make that claim slightly arbitrary? What is personhood based in, if not?
Oh, yeah. So
do you see what I'm getting at?
Sort of. The scriptures say, though, that God created humans, male and female distinct. They're the only ones in Genesis 1:26, 1:27 to made in the image of God.
Right,
and
exactly.
so he called animals good, but they are not image bearers.
Okay,
but that word create is barah in Hebrew, and it's not clear whether or not that is created in an instant over a long period of time. And we as believers, I find no contradiction into saying that God could have created an instant, of which I would be pleased, I'll ask God when I get to heaven how this all unfolded, or was it a process of adaptation and species change? Very smart Christians are on both sides of this issue, and so there's what we call in Christianity closed-hand theological issues and open-hand theological issues. Closed-hand issues would be like the resurrection of Christ, the Trinity, and then there's open-handed, which would be like eschatology or the Eucharist or the creation account. This one allows, given the verbiage, it could be either way.
Fine. I think just, I don't want to take up too much time then, but just kind of on that, you were talking a little bit about Christian values, and I'm intrigued by that. I get the sense that you're very much motivated by your faith. To what extent do you think Donald Trump embodies gospel values?
Yeah, so he reminds me very much of Samson in the Bible. Both had, you can laugh. How many of you guys actually know about Samson? Great hair. He was a man willing to fight for a cause greater than he, despite some of his own moral troublings and moral missteps. All throughout the Bible, from King David to others, there are plenty of Abraham. Moses murdered somebody. How many people knew that? Moses murdered somebody. How dare you? You could say a lot. Donald Trump has never murdered anybody. But Moses is like the most revered man in Judaism. You know, he was a murderer in Egypt. He took someone aside and just slammed him in the head and actually had to flee all the way to Midian because of it. We're all flawed. We all have original sin. How do I reconcile what he's doing with gospel values?
Well, for instance, I mean, the gospel values to me would be, humility, compassion, forgiveness. Does he live according to those values, do you think?
I actually, at times, I will say, he's far more magnanimous than people will give him credit. None of us are able to fill all those values. I will say some values that I think he does fulfill. He is a truth teller. And the gospel says very clearly that telling of the truth is one of the most fundamental things, the spoken word. So I'm not going to spend time here defining every moral decision that Donald Trump has made or not made. I am equally a sinner as Donald Trump. We all are. We all fall short of the glory of God. But I will say that his willingness to rise to the occasion of something greater than he, to endure being shot and almost shot again and almost 700 years in federal prison, is one of the most courageous actions I've ever seen from a public elected official in the history of the West.
Do you think Jesus would have voted for Trump?
Do I think Jesus, first of all, Jesus intentionally didn't vote and did not care about the Roman guard. You remember he said, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God's what is God. Do I think Jesus would love some of the stuff that Trump is doing?
It's a silly question, but I'm just,
No, I mean, fine. It's like, what did Jesus teach us? Jesus says, don't touch children. Okay, so he would love the fact that Donald Trump repealed Roe versus Wade. He would love the fact that child sex trafficking is being focused on in this current government. Jesus Christ said a lot of things such as, sin no more, and things such as love your neighbor are things that we should embody in every single one of our public policy decisions. So Jesus is divine, and he would not fill out a ballot.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but that was a fascinating exchange to watch unfold. Because if we're being honest, it took a while to get there. The conversation moved through theology, evolution, biblical interpretation, and a number of other topics before finally arriving at the question that really mattered. The question that seemed to change the entire dynamic of the discussion. Does Donald Trump embody Christian values? And perhaps even more importantly, would the teachings of Jesus align with the kind of politics and behavior that Donald Trump represents? That's where things got interesting. Because up until that point, Charlie Kirk seemed relatively comfortable navigating the discussion. But once the conversation shifted from abstract religious beliefs to applying those beliefs to a real-world political figure, the answers suddenly became a lot more complicated. And that's understandable. After all, it's one thing to support a politician because you agree with their policies. Millions of people do that every election cycle. It's another thing entirely to argue that a politician reflects the values and example found in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Those are two very different conversations. What stood out to me was Charlie Kirk's emphasis on truth. Earlier in the discussion, he talked about the importance of truth and honesty as fundamental Christian values. And that's exactly why the later part of the exchange becomes so important. Because once truth becomes the standard you're using to evaluate people, that standard has to apply to everyone equally, friends, opponents, and political allies alike. And this is where many critics of Donald Trump raise concerns. When people think about the teachings commonly associated with Jesus, ideas like humility, forgiveness, compassion, mercy, and caring for those on the margins of society, they often struggle to see those same qualities reflected in Trump's public image and communication style. Take humility, for example. One of the most consistent themes throughout Christian teaching is the idea of placing others before yourself and avoiding excessive self-promotion. Yet Trump's critics argue that his political brand has often centered around personal credit, personal victories, and personal achievements. Likewise, when it comes to forgiveness and reconciliation, critics point to his frequent public feuds and confrontational approach toward opponents. Supporters may view that as strength and toughness. Critics see something very different. And that's really the heart of the debate. Not whether Trump has supporters. Clearly he does. Not whether people agree with his policies. Clearly many do. But whether his public conduct reflects the values that Charlie Kirk and others claim are central to Christianity. That's the question that remains unresolved. Then there's the issue of caring for vulnerable people. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly focused attention on those who were struggling, excluded, or overlooked by society. Different people interpret modern policy issues differently, of course, but critics often point to immigration debates and ask whether the rhetoric surrounding those discussions aligns with that message of compassion and mercy. Again, people will have different answers. But these are the questions that naturally arise when someone argues that a political leader represents Christian values. And finally, let's talk about perhaps the most controversial claim made during the exchange, the idea that Donald Trump is a truth-teller. For supporters, that description makes perfect sense. They see someone who speaks directly, challenges institutions, and says things other politicians are unwilling to say. Critics, however, see the exact opposite. They point to years of fact-checks, disputed statements, and public controversies as evidence that the picture is far more complicated than simply calling someone a truth-teller. And that's why this exchange attracted so much attention. Because at the end of the day, the question wasn't really about politics. It wasn't even really about Donald Trump. It was about consistency. If someone claims that truth, humility, compassion, and forgiveness are essential values, then people are naturally going to ask whether the leaders they support are being measured by those same standards. That's what made this conversation so compelling. For me, the most revealing part wasn't necessarily the answer itself. It was how difficult the question seemed to be. Sometimes the questions that generate the longest explanations are the ones that reveal the most. But that's just my take. As always, I want to hear your thoughts. Did Charlie Kirk successfully answer the question, or do you think the discussion exposed a contradiction in the argument he was trying to make? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.